Prior to April 24, 2022, U.S. intelligence agencies expressed concerns that the Ukrainian military would succumb to a Russian attack within a few days. Now, after 15 months have passed, analysts believe that the conflict is unlikely to reach a resolution this year. The question remains, how long will the fighting continue? Will it last for 1 year, multiple years, or indefinitely? There are several uncertainties that will determine the outcome, especially considering that both Russia and Ukraine show no signs of backing down. However, the availability of weapons and other resources is not infinite. Will the Russian people be able to withstand the pressure, or will Washington grow wary and shift its priorities instead of continuing to support Kiev? What potential scenarios could unfold to shape the conclusion of the conflict in Eastern Europe? We invite you to explore these questions in today's World Affairs. Germany's promise early this year to send tanks to Ukraine marked the country's latest concession and provided a cap to the gradual escalation in the kind of equipment allies were supplying. This also exemplifies the unpredictable nature inherent in all conflicts. Indeed, when Russia invaded Ukraine last February, its allies resisted pleas for offensive aid and followed a narrow definition of protective equipment. In Berlin, leaders initially shied away from aid that didn't fit the German definition of defensive. That has changed, with Germany now pledging to deliver Leopard 2 battle tanks and approving other countries' requests to follow suit. Chancellor Olaf Scholz also recently authorized supplying infantry fighting vehicles to help push Russian forces out of occupied Ukraine. The evolving approach fits a conflict as fluid as it is unpredictable. Now, a collection of Western tank-type vehicles is slated to arrive on the front lines this spring, with training already underway in donor countries. The vehicles carry the hope of enabling battlefield wins for Ukrainian forces that will lead to some kind of war-ending scenario, if the weapons arrive in time. However, even in such circumstances, is it possible for a resolution to emerge in the near future? Scholz has told Tagesspiegel newspaper he wants Russian President Vladimir Putin to answer one question: how is the world getting out of this terrible situation? Defense News spoke with national security analysts, lawmakers, and retired officials, asking each how the conflict could end. The answers are glum. The war will be expensive, cost lives, and likely last at least a few years, or even become interminable. It will tax the American and European defense industries, especially when it comes to munitions, and could cause economic ruin in Russia. All this while the possibility of nuclear escalation remains. And they said winning will depend on a Congress with the resolve to ensure continued support to Ukraine. But even then, the very concept of victory may be inaccurate, they warned. For this year, it would be very, very difficult to militarily eject the Russian forces from every inch of Ukraine or Russian-occupied Ukraine. General Mark Milley, chairman of the U.S. military's Joint Chiefs of Staff, told reporters during a visit to Germany last month. That doesn't mean it can't happen, doesn't mean it won't happen, be very, very difficult. Milley has insisted the war will likely end at the negotiating table at some point. Officials and experts expect a bloody spring as Russia sends new conscripts to the front line and Ukraine tries to repel an offensive while mounting its own. As the war enters its second year, the spigot of military aid is still gushing, but industrial capabilities are spotty and nations have started to scrutinize how much equipment they can spare while maintaining their own self-defense requirements and that of NATO. At the same time, election season in the United States, Ukraine's most important backer, stands to spur arguments that a war in Europe of unknown duration is a costly nuisance for America. Asked about the likely duration of the Ukraine war, analysts in the United States and Europe made similar predictions, with timelines running from months to years to indefinite. Johann Michel, a research analyst in Berlin with the International Institute for Strategic Studies think tank, anticipates long months ahead. while Michael Kaufman, the research program director in the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis in Washington, expects additional years of fighting. Wars typically tend to go on longer than people expect or hope, but especially interstate conflicts of this length, Kaufman said. History tells us that wars which go on this long are likely to become protracted, lasting several years. Perhaps Italian analyst Lucio Caracciolo was the most pessimistic of all. This war will last indefinitely with long pauses for ceasefires. He said it will only stop when Ukraine or Russia or both collapse, since for both sides this is a matter of life or death, added Caracciolo, the editor of Italian geopolitics publication Limes. Peter Roberts, a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, said there are different ways to define the end of a war, the end of the kinetic phase versus the end of a Georgia-style frozen conflict or a Korea-like situation that runs for years. Michel added there are as yet unknown factors that will determine the end of the conflict. Who will be first to launch the next offensive? What role will the weather play? He wondered. There is the problem of ammunition. The first sign to have a shortage will be in trouble. While there has been no real European program to increase production, will Russian stocks be replenished by China? And long, exhaustive fighting carries its own risks, according to Benjamin Jensen, a wargaming expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's because the longer conflicts last, the more they exhaust finite resources, and hence the parties are more willing to gamble. Either side may act boldly if it winds up on the ropes and needs an exit strategy. Ukraine, Jensen suggested, might try a spectacular special operation to assassinate a Kremlin official, or Russia could decide to use or simply test nuclear weapons. In Jensen's view, even the collapse of Russia's conventional force or a traditional Ukrainian victory may not mean the war is over. Either could lead to nuclear escalation by Russia. Daniel Rice, a former U.S. Army captain, now president of the Thayer Leadership Consulting Group in West Point, New York, said that the worry is that a large Russian offensive action could punch through, and there's a lot of worry they could take Kiev. People are waking up to the reality that you need to give offensive weapons to end this war, at least to win it. The challenge now is training and equipping an armored force big enough and sophisticated enough to envelop Russia's fighting force. Ukrainian soldiers will have to learn how to operate and sustain the latest batch of military aid, which includes Marder and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles from Germany and the United States, as well as Challenger 2, Leopard 2, and Abrams tanks from the UK, Germany, and the US, respectively. Also in the mix is a pledge from France to ship AMX-10 RC Light wheeled tanks. It's a lot to do in a short period of time, Rice said. Just because they have just the right vehicles doesn't mean you're going to be able to take a major future offensive action. But these Ukrainians have surprised the world every time. Retired Major General Patrick Donahoe, a former commander of the U.S. Army's Maneuver Warfare School at Fort Benning, Georgia, said Western upgrades offer Ukraine the chance to dominate the close fight with Russian adversaries and conclude a tactical fighting to its advantage. Russian forces are already trying to slow down tanks in Ukraine with mines, trenches, and pyramidal concrete dragon's teeth, a type of fortification not seen in combat since World War II. Ukrainian forces, once equipped and trained for combined arms warfare and tank tactics, will be designed to punch a hole through a defensive network, Donahoe predicted. But the sizable swaths of terrain Ukraine wants to liberate will take time, and to even build the necessary forces will take 6 months, Donahoe estimated. The recent arms donations, Kiev still wants fighter aircraft and long-range tactical missiles, are predicated on the assumption they will force Moscow to end its invasion and begin negotiations because military costs are too high. The West once believed it could isolate Russia and prevent Moscow from pouring more resources into the fighting in Ukraine. How did this effort yield results after over a year? In the course of the past year, Putin's domestic propaganda strategy has morphed from a message of fight the Nazis in Ukraine to fight the West there, said Stefan Meister, a Russia and Eastern Europe expert at the Berlin-based German Council on Foreign Relations. The narrative is the great struggle of the Cold War, he said, a framing that has helped to attract new recruits. And the near total control of information by the government is making dissent difficult. Those who are against the war have left, and those who remain are adapting, Meister said. Past attempts to squeeze the will for war out of Moscow economically also didn't yield the immediate results for which experts hoped. Cracks may begin to appear this year, however. The consensus is that ordinary Russians will start feeling it this year, said Charles Litchfield, an economics and sanctions analyst at the Washington-based Atlantic Council. But Russians have a huge degree of tolerance for economic pain. Moscow has proved resourceful when it comes to building autonomy into critical goods, Litchfield explained. For example, the tactic of repurposing dishwasher electronics for weapons, marked in the West as a sign of desperation, probably means somebody thought about that from the beginning, he said. One area to watch is Russia's payment of pensions. An inability to do so could foster economic discontent capable of turning public opinion against the war, Litchfield told Defense News. It would have to get pretty bad for the Russians to get there, he said, adding that there's no way of knowing how many reserves the government stashed away after years of fact checks from energy sales. After imposing sanctions and export controls, Litchfield expects the West's latest economic pressure point, oil price caps, to yield results because the Russian economy is so tightly linked to the energy market. The United States, as Ukraine's most important military supporter, remains the center of gravity when it comes to an eventual outcome for the conflict. American leadership has so far been largely united in their support for Kiev. Representative Adam Smith of Washington, the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, expects the war to end at the negotiating table, but said serious diplomacy hasn't begun because Putin is still clinging to maximalist goals. The ultimate end to this is the Ukrainian take back as much pre-February 24th territory as they can get, force Putin to bargaining table, and then ultimately Ukraine would have to compromise somewhat on issues like Crimea and portions of the east and arrange for solid security guarantees going forward, Smith told Defense News in a phone interview. Right now, the Russians are talking about a major offensive in the next 4 months, he added. It seems like the Russians are at least thinking that they have some possibility of succeeding in that effort. I am skeptical. For its part, the Biden administration has started deliberations around the thorny question of whether helping Ukraine should entail retaking Crimea, which Russia seized and then annexed in 2014. That would be an extraordinarily risky thing to do, Smith said, but it's important to have those conversations, and from what I understand, high levels of our government have talked about it. Charles Kupchan, a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and the former National Security Council Director for European Affairs in the Obama administration, said he would not encourage Ukraine to seek to reassert control over Crimea by force simply because the escalation risks are very high. Crimea is of considerable strategic importance to Russia, Kupchan told Defense News. It looms large historically. It's difficult for me to imagine that the Russians would accept complete defeat and expulsion from Crimea. But some on Capitol Hill are more bullish about lining up behind President Volodymyr Zelensky's goal of fully restoring Ukraine's sovereignty over its territory. Senator Richard Blumenthal D. Kahn visited Ukraine in January and subsequently told Defense News at a news conference that the American military has consistently underestimated the Ukrainian fighting ability. Everything I have come to learn about the will and determination of the Ukrainians leads me to conclude retaking Crimea is within reach, and they need the artillery that will enable hitting targets, the sites of missiles destroying infrastructure in Ukraine, he said. Blumenthal has joined other lawmakers, particularly pro-Ukraine Republicans, in pushing President Joe Biden to give Zelensky most of the weapons he requested, including long-range ATACMS missiles and F-16 fighter aircraft. Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, the top Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee, also called for sending long-range missiles to Ukraine alongside advanced Grey Eagle and Reaper drones. We should deliver these assets quickly to make an immediate difference on the battlefield, Wicker said on the Senate floor in January. In concert with our allies, this approach of more, better, faster would give the Ukrainians a real shot at victory. While the Biden administration has voiced concerns that sending ATACMs to Ukraine could enable strikes into Russia, potentially escalating the war into a broader conflict with NATO, the Ukrainians could use those long-range missiles to strike Russian launch points on their own territory, including in Crimea. Smith indicated he disagrees with the Biden administration's decision not to send long-range missiles, noting every Ukrainian official assured him they would not use them to attack Russia. But Smith also said ATACM's producer Lockheed Martin no longer makes the missiles, and the U.S. military still needs them in its stockpiles. The Biden administration earlier this month announced it is sending Ukraine the ground-launched small diameter bomb. The GLSDB has a range of up to 93 miles, doubling Ukraine's strike range. However, that still falls short of the ATACMS, which would allow Ukraine to strike Russian targets about 190 miles away. The Storm Shadow missiles recently received by Ukraine from the UK have a range of approximately 155 miles. Depending on how long the war lasts, it remains far from certain whether lawmakers will keep funding Ukraine aid packages. Congress provided more than $100 billion in aid to Kiev since Russia invaded last year, including $61.4 billion in military aid. As of 25 February 2023, the U.S. has provided Ukraine 1,600 air defense systems, 2 anti-ship weapons, 58,500 anti-tank systems, more than 113 million artillery rounds and conventional armor, 320 artillery weapons, 58 coastal patrol boats, 15,000 grenade launchers and small arms, 2,500 drones, 20 helicopters, nearly 57,000 missiles and rockets, 86 radars, 76 tanks, 88 trailers and transport heavy equipment, and more than 3,600 vehicles. The Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, told the Senate in January the Biden administration still expects the $45 billion Ukraine aid package Congress passed in December to last through the end of this fiscal year. But the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Celeste Wallander, warned at the hearing that the current funding level does not preclude the administration from needing to request more assistance before the end of September. While the bipartisan majority of lawmakers support arming Kiev, 57 Republicans voted against a $40 billion emergency aid supplemental in May. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy made several concessions to those Ukraine aid skeptics to secure the votes to win his protracted speakership battle. It took 15 votes for McCarthy to secure the position, after which he appointed 3 Republicans who opposed Ukraine aid. But another McCarthy concession, a procedure allowing 218 members to force a House floor vote on any bill, could present an opportunity for pro-Ukraine Republicans and Democrats to pass additional funding for Kiev. Still, the political dynamics may become more complicated in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election, as some prominent Ukraine aid opponents, including former President Donald Trump and Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, have already thrown their hats into the ring or are reportedly considering doing so. One key question that could determine the war's endgame is how long Ukraine's backers can keep up their arms donations to Kiev. There's no such thing as infinite resources, said Jensen, the CSIS analyst. Heaven forbid this goes on another year, 2 years. At some point, the fighting will exhaust even the entirety of the Western world's support for Ukraine. While defense spending in the United States and Europe is trending upward, in large part because of Russia's attack, industrial capacity to crank out weapons and ammunition has emerged as a bottleneck. In response, companies on both sides of the Atlantic announced plans to restart production lines for artillery shells and other weapons considered somewhat arcane until recently. Wicker said the fiscal 2023 government funding and defense authorization bills include money to expand munitions and manufacturing, doubling and even tripling production capabilities for weapons like 155mm shells, anti-tank javelins, and the high-mobility artillery rocket system. Still, it's an open question whether the U.S. will be able to indefinitely continue its current level of support, said Mark Hansen, a CSIS senior advisor who has studied the volumes of artillery used in the war. There are still many unknown factors impacting the dynamics of the conflict in Ukraine. We hope that you will continue to join us and explore these in future programs. For now, thank you for your attention. Goodbye and see you again.